The clouds passed away and the wind came down from the northwest with extraordinary ferocity. For weeks, certainly not less than 2 weeks, the mercury in the thermometer tube was not, on any one morning, higher than 12 degrees below zero. The wind was a steady, fierce gale from the northwest, day and night. The air was filled with flying snow, which blinded the eyes and almost stopped the breath of anyone who attempted to face it. No man could, for any considerable length of time, make his way on foot against it.
Imagine yourself writing in your diary of a winter's day by candlelight. While outside, the northwest winds howl, blowing snow against the door, a small barrier between you and the elements. The fire you made in the fireplace begins to lose the battle to heat your log home. You shiver with the fear that your ink might freeze under the harshest conditions you have ever experienced. You attempt to divert your wavering thoughts of the day when a burst of warmth breaks the icy grip to no avail. Scenes like this were common among the inhabitants of central Illinois during the winter seasons of the 19th century. Throughout the recent decades, we have experienced the rage of winter's wrath. To some of us, winter's fury has been a major inconvenience, stumping transportation or an occasional power outage that disables the use of the internet. Whatever the inconvenience, those before us had to struggle even more. We sometimes forget how difficult it truly was for them. Explore with us the history of those bone-chilling nights when the skies unleashed its wrath that defines an Illinois winter.
The prairie. A landscape of waving grasses, flat terrain separated by creeks bordered by towering trees. Humans would think that the peaceful landscape was uninteresting, but its simple beauty can be breathtaking.
Well, the prairies of central and east central Illinois were largely characterized by tall, warm season grasses of 6 to about 9 feet tall. Now, a tall grass prairie is a community dominated by grasses and flowers, or what we call forbs, and is nearly devoid of shrubbery and trees. Now, these prairie communities were originally maintained by fires, whether they be naturally induced or induced by Native Americans.
By 1809, migrants from Kentucky, Indiana, the Carolinas, and New England were beginning to move into the virgin landscape of the Illinois Territory, first entering the South and spreading northward through the territory. It wasn't until the 1830s that settlers began to tame Illinois' Serengeti of tallgrass prairies and thinly timbered savannas. This was due to the misconception that prairie soils were much less fertile than the woodland soils that pioneers were accustomed to in east and southeast of central and eastern Illinois.
What few people realize is that the tallgrass prairie community was very diverse and very dynamic, and literally it was a Serengeti type of ecosystem that stretched all the way from western Ohio through central Illinois, where it really it reached its greatest abundance, and then went all the way west into Kansas and eastern Nebraska.
Settlers brought with them everything they owned for their new life, which at the time was little indeed. Trees were felled near streams and rivers to place their one-room log home and prepare for growing crops for food and raising livestock. In those days, and especially in preparation for the uncertain winter ahead, heating was a major concern in the construction of their log home.
In the cabins, just like the Lincolns have, like numerous other settlers have, they've got one fireplace to heat the home, but you might have a loft where you have people sleep And so that loft only gets what heat is radiated from that fireplace, from that chimney, into that portion of the house. And so if it's 20 degrees outside, it's going to be colder inside, even though you've got the fire going. They would certainly live in different ways than we did. They wouldn't use they didn't obviously have open floor plans, but they didn't use all the rooms in the house in the wintertime because it really wasn't economical to heat all of those rooms, especially if you were only going to be in it for such a brief amount of time. And so they would have rooms in the house that they might not use in the wintertime. In today's home, we've got an open floor plan, and you want to be able to utilize all of your space. And so, you'll heat a 14,000 square foot house. Our predecessors would look at that as very wasteful, especially considering the fact that they're not just paying somebody to deliver the propane or the gas or the electricity or what they need to heat their home. They're actually having to go out and fell the trees and split the wood and stack the wood and bring that into the home to actually heat their home. And so they probably understood the value of that heat source a little bit more than people do in the 21st century.
Across the new landscape, neighbors would be a short distance away and villages would be near enough to transport crops for selling. Farm families, when you travel through the countryside today, you're going several miles sometimes before you find another house. Once you get into the true country, when you're in anywhere near the towns and cities, of course, there's the sprawl that comes out from them. But when you get out into true rural areas, there are fewer people per square mile today than there were in the 19th century. Once established in their home, clearing trees and plowing the land for growing crops was an arduous task that took a great deal of effort and time to complete in time for planting. Failure to complete the task resulted in a failed harvest and starvation during the following winter. The first year's harvest would be enough to secure food for the upcoming winter. Year by year, the settlers would expand their land in hopes of growing more crops to sell for profit if there was a surplus.
The winters before the storm were unusually warm for the settlers of central Illinois. Since agriculture was very much tied to climate, farmers were delighted in the abundance of harvest they could reap through the long, warm growing season. Seeds of corn would be planted in the spring after the last frost. As the warm summer engulfed the region, the inhabitants would devote all the possible daylight hours to cultivating the crops.
Well, once John Deere invented the plow, much of the tallgrass prairies went into cultivation in central and east central Illinois. And typically during the spring and summer, you would have the land that would be plowed, then disked, then cultivated by various tools. And a lot of these tools are very primitive at the time. You might have one plow and then a small cultivator, a hose, then the crop would go into the ground and would grow through the summer, and cultivation would continue throughout the summer months because no herbicides were used at the time. You also have to remember during this entire period no fertilizers were used, and that was really the key that really allowed agriculture to blossom in central and east central Illinois, was the fact that these prairie soils of glacial origin were very fertile, naturally fertile, so fertilizers weren't needed too much, and therefore an abundance of food could be produced without the use of a lot of chemicals that we see now in modern agriculture.
Toiling in the blazing sun and cooling off in summer rains, work continued as it was the goal for survival. Not only were fields planted for food, but also acquiring fuel for the upcoming winter was vital to provide heat for home and cooking. Weather forecasts were not yet available, except from the Farmers Almanac. Yet, to purchase their publication was not a necessity. Knowing how to read the skies was the only tool farmers had to determine the conditions of the day and possibly the next day. Even that was a long-term forecast.
You're talking about a period in history where various settlers from Europe were coming to the United States to start farming land, and they really didn't have a clear-cut idea of the climate. And weather forecasts weren't available, so certainly they had to rely on signs in the sky to predict weather. In fact, many of the signs that they did see in the sky and tools they used to predict the weather back then are still actually quite useful now in some respects.
The warm winters before the storm spawned the idea of expanding the type of crops the settlers planted. Although cotton was a southern crop, Illinois farmers were attempting to dabble in the economic prospects of introducing the crop in the region due to the mild winters. John Carroll Powers, a Sangamon County historian, wrote that he built a cotton gin in the hopes of harvesting cotton. However, in the coming winter of the deep snow, this venture would fail. When the warmth of the spring was in the air, fruit-bearing trees began to bud and blossom. Leaves of the tall grasses across the landscape began to fill with a brilliant green. However, the skies of the north would fool Mother Nature and grip the land with a frosty hand, plummeting temperatures, and the region would once again slip into winter. Seeds that were planted and sprung forth with life were killed. Farmers lost most of what they planted. This occasional scenario killed further ideas of introducing new, unreliable crops.
Well, when the first settlers arrived in central and east central Illinois in the 1820s, we went through a period of quite mild climate with long growing seasons. In fact, doing research, it appears that some of the last frosts in spring at that time were in mid to late March, and the first frost and freezes were in November. So we had a very long growing season, but by the 1830s, around 1830 right up through about 1840, the growing seasons were cut short. The climate turned quite cold, and we had several very snowy, harsh winters that really led to a lot of hardships and caught a lot of settlers off guard.
Southern Illinois has long had the nickname Little Egypt, and it's really goes with a biblical reference of the famine, and then of course Egypt was the grain basket, and so all of the people would go into Egypt and purchase what they needed to take back home with them. And really the same thing happens here in Illinois. After that year 1831, you find so many farmers and so many people that live in the central and northern part of the state having to go south to purchase corn, to purchase wheat, to get themselves through the winter. And so, you know, they look to the Bible and they look to that reference and they see the same thing happening to them, and so they're going down into Egypt to purchase what they need to survive that winter in the next year.
Wavering thoughts of the day when a burst of warmth breaks the icy grip to no avail. Scenes like this were common among the inhabitants of central Illinois during the winter seasons of the 19th century. Throughout the recent decades, we have experienced the rage of winter's wrath. To some of us, winter's fury has been a major inconvenience, stumping transportation or an occasional power outage that disables the use of the internet. Whatever the inconvenience, those before us had to struggle even more. We sometimes forget how difficult
Certainly not less than 2 weeks. The mercury in the thermometer tube was not, on any one morning, higher than 12 degrees below zero. The wind was a steady, fierce gale from the northwest, day and night. The air was filled with flying snow, which blinded the eyes and almost stopped the breath of anyone who attempted to face it. No man could, for any considerable length of time, make his way on foot against it. The clouds passed away and the wind came down from the northwest with extraordinary ferocity. For weeks,
Imagine yourself writing in your diary of a winter's day by candlelight. While outside, the northwest winds howl, blowing snow against the door, a small barrier between you and the elements. The fire you made in the fireplace begins to lose the battle to heat your log home. You shiver with the fear that your ink might freeze under the harshest conditions you have ever experienced. You attempt to divert your